So, let me introduce my colleague and friend, Helen Bennett. As you heard earlier, I began to do some work back now a number of years ago in England, moving through some of the children's hospices, even staying at times in the parent rooms of some of the children's hospices. And I remember a story from Martin House Children's Hospice, which is up in the north of England between Leeds and York. And I was doing a session, leading a workshop for staff that day. And we were about 45 minutes into the session, and there was a knock on the outside door just behind me. And I turned to see what was the interruption, what was going on. It was the head care nurse. It was the Catherine Caney kind of person. And she said, "Oh, Ted, you're going to have to move out of your room because a child has just been released from the hospital and he's coming over right away. Ted, would you move your suitcase and move to a different room?" It was family first. Family first. Even the guest speaker needs to move because the families get the best of care. It was that kind of experience at Martin House and then at Naomi House where I first met Helen working there. We've done now 3 or 4 workshops together there. We did a regional workshop for that southern tier of England. And for the last 5 years, she's been one of the lead persons at Alexander Devine Children's Hospice in England. She did a PhD a few years ago related to this subject that you see now on the slide. And when we began to talk about this, we wanted her to be here, and she said yes. So welcome, Helen. We're glad to have you. We're eager to hear an English accent.
Is that good? Can you hear me? I'm really honored to be here. I've traveled with my son. That made me emotional. We were also so beautifully welcomed yesterday at Crescent Cove. We've gained so much in meeting the team, looking around, and it is a real privilege to be with you today. It's been really lovely to have that connection with Crescent Cove. As Ted said, I work at Alexander Devine Children's Hospice Service. We are a children's hospice service that covers one of the counties, Berkshire, just outside of London. And I think we've grown together with Crescent Cove. We started as a community service and a charity as an organisation about 15 years ago. But in the same way Crescent Cove has built, or you've been part of establishing a hospice, so have we at Alexander Devine, and we are also just only 4.5 years old in terms of our building. So it's been lovely to journey with you in regards to all the things that we have learnt together. And thank you, Ted, for that too. So as you've said, I'm Helen. I'm actually a children's nurse, and I was really honoured to be able to undertake my PhD in advanced care planning supported by the University of Southampton. And I just wanted to check out with you that when I'm talking about advanced care planning, that we're actually on the same page here. So advanced care planning back in the UK is a process or a conversation with families around not just their end-of-life wishes, but also their choices and their preferences for living, what matters most to them as families, as well as the treatment decisions. And I guess I just wanted to check out, I guess you might call that advanced directives in the US. There were some nods, but same sort of thing. It's not just about treatment decisions or resuscitation. It's far wider than that in terms of the conversations that we might have with families. So these are the findings from my PhD, and lost sound. Oh no, there it is. Reframing our approach to advanced care planning. I interviewed and talked with a number of parents around their experience of advanced care planning, and I learned so much from those conversations. So before I start, there's some real thank yous. I need to recognise the University of Southampton, who funded and paid for my PhD, and of course Alexander Devine. I was working with them at the time I started, and the support that you've given me throughout the duration of the study. And I particularly wanted to highlight Professor Alison Richardson, and Professor Sue Duke. Sue is the one here on this far side, who were my supervisors. And without their wisdom and belief that I could achieve this, I don't think I would have got to the end. And I've got Ted here to represent all those wonderful critical debates and conversations that you have along the way with colleagues and with friends who have really shaped my thinking. A PhD or any study really is not a sole venture. It's the critical discussions that you have along the way. So I'm briefly going to address today a bit of a background to the study. What did we know about advanced care planning before I started the study? I do want to talk about the methods. For those of you not interested, you could have a little nap at this point if you wanted. But then to talk about the findings and the analysis, and to explain a little bit about how we developed the grounded theory. And I'll explain more about why that matters and the importance of what it means in practice. So where did I start? When I did my training a number of years ago, there was no communication skills training. We didn't talk about what mattered to patients and families. We talked about anatomy and physiology and treatment decisions. And there was most definitely, as I moved into working with children and families, no training around advanced care planning. We knew little about advanced care planning other than filling in a form. So I look back over my career and some of the conversations that I had with families, and I have some uncomfortable reflections where I think that maybe I pitched the conversation wrong and that I made some mistakes. But actually, what I learned was from the role models of shadowing others who had experience in conversations with families, and particularly learning from parents and how they engaged with me and what they taught me. But when I came to thinking about my PhD, I had this nagging belief that there was something more. I had a curious thinking that maybe there was something more about advanced care planning. So I started by looking at what we currently understood about advanced care planning. And the majority of the studies and papers were around evaluations, audits of forms, how we developed the tools, and the dominant narrative was that of professionals. There really was very little that looked at parents' experience. Yet we know that parents have the unique experience of caring for their child with a life-limiting illness and significant insight into the experience of advanced care planning. Yet there were hardly any studies at all that looked at parents' perspective. So when I started the study, there were actually only 3 papers that really gave us an understanding from a parent's point of view. The reason I've now got 15 is with any study, we went back at the end of our study to look at which papers had now been published. And there has been a remarkable emergence of understanding around advanced care planning, and we found 15 papers that looked at parents' perspective. So what we did with that systematic literature review was to analyze the findings from those 15 papers, and we mapped them against the family sense of coherence theory. And that looks at how parents perceive, experience, and organize their world, how they make sense of the world for themselves as a family. And what we found was that advanced care planning for families tended to focus on treatment decisions. And in contrast, really, it was at odds with what parents felt mattered most to them as a family. We also found that actually parents do want to participate in advanced care planning. They valued the conversations, but they wanted those conversations to take account of their day-to-day life, their family values, their hopes, and their goals. And parents also wanted timely conversations and ongoing conversations to explore options for care and treatment. But most importantly, I think what we recognized that this important process or this space to enable families to engage in advanced care planning, that we needed further exploration as to what it really means to parents. So this is the bit, if you're not interested, don't worry, but I am excited by it. So we chose because conversations are co-constructed between parents and professionals to take a constructivist and situated analysis grounded theory approach by Sharmez and Clark. While I was undertaking my study, very sadly, Sharmez died, but she had just published a new book around grounded theory, and so I'm really delighted that I was able to incorporate that into my PhD. The two things I wanted to particularly pull out at this point around methods is two really important aspects of learning. We had a patient and public involvement, so we had a parents' forum who helped co-design the study. And that was really important, that they helped with the patient participation leaflet, with the consent form, with formulating the questions that we might ask at the interview. And the reason that that was important was because, as some of you may know, trying to do research in children's palliative care can be really challenging in trying to, in the UK, we have to go through what is an ethics committee. And there'd been so many papers published that explained about the challenges of trying to get through ethics. And actually, I really think because we chose to do a co-design with parents, and we were able to demonstrate the input that they'd had into the design of the study, that we were successful first time with no recommendations in terms of the ethics. And the second point was that when we went through to identifying participants, we used, back in the UK, 2 regional children's community nursing teams to identify participants. And numbers were really low. And we needed to really unpack with the children's community nurses why that was. And when I spoke with them, they talked about, well, they were the gatekeeping parents, really. They thought that the subject was too distressing, and other times they would say, well, we can't possibly speak about your study with these parents because they're too vulnerable. And actually, as we began to recruit into the study and we started talking with parents, they did not self-define themselves as such. They wanted the opportunity to participate in the study and for them to have that choice of whether they wanted to be involved or not. So we had a lot of work to do with the children's community nursing teams to share what the study was about, the benefits and the value of the study, and to get champions, really, who would then advocate for the study within the team meetings where they were identifying parents that might want to participate. So we collected data between March 2015 and 2017 via semi-structured interviews, and we also looked at 9 advanced care plans. And we interviewed those parents, and they were transcribed and data analysed along the constant comparative approach. And that enabled us to do 1 or 2 interviews, to analyse those interviews, and then to change the shape of the questions so that we could go back and check out things we wanted to understand a little bit more about, or to ask some questions where we've really identified there were some gaps. So we moved from initial coding to focused coding, and that enabled us to develop concepts and categories. And then we looked at the connection and relationship between those categories to identify a core category and a basic social process. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about those as we go on. So we interviewed 13 parents of 10 children. 4 of those parents were bereaved, and the others were currently caring for their children with a life-limiting condition. And they came, as I said, from a caseload of 2 children's community nursing teams within the south of England. Our community nursing teams in England are attached to the hospitals, so I think maybe similar to how you would describe your community nurses here. All the parents were interviewed once, and they had the choice of whether they wanted to be interviewed separately or together. And again, that was really interesting, those parents that chose to be interviewed together and how between them they co-constructed that interview and how they bounced ideas off one another in their understanding advanced care planning. And I think that that was one of the things that I felt when I came out at the other end that would be really interesting to further research, is to understand how families together have those experiences and construct their understanding. And as I said, we looked then at 9 advanced care plans. So the process of analysis supported 3 categories: realization, reconciling multiple tensions, and building confidence and asserting control. And the families moved in and between these categories. It wasn't linear by any means at all. So the categories were intertwined, and that explains the theory, Reconstructing Meaning through Advanced Care Planning. And I'm going to explain in more detail. So realization is the first category, so where parents recognized changes in their child's condition. And there are a number of concepts that help explain that category. And the first one being knowledge and experience. Parents came with knowledge and experience of looking after a child with a life-limiting condition that shaped and influenced their engagement in advanced care planning. What we found here, though, was engaging advanced care planning and the decision-making around that was distinctly different than just making day-to-day treatment decisions, because it was immersed in the emotion and grief and that worst possible outcome that their child might die. And as this father wrote here, it's not a completely alien concept when you have a child with complex needs. The second concept here is defining moment and using triggers. So families themselves identified multiple triggers which indicated to them that their child's condition was changing. So, for example, they recognized increased severity of symptoms, treatment escalation, increased admissions to hospital or to PICU, and the frequency and length of stay, and finally then the increased interactions with professionals and palliative care professionals. Picking up on a point that Ted said earlier as well, parents, one of the other concepts was that of avoiding, but this was not the same as denial. Parents recognized that they might avoid conversations, but this was a way of coping. They had strategies that they wanted to be able to have the birthday party. They wanted the joy of the day, and it might be that they just needed to park conversations around advanced care planning. We're so easy, quickly move as professionals to say, oh, well, they don't want to talk, therefore they're in denial. And it wasn't that case at all. And then conversely, parents also noted that healthcare professionals might avoid the conversation. And we know from a number of studies that professionals have highlighted their lack of confidence in those conversations, that they don't want to put parents in a distressing position. So they likewise were avoiding the conversation. And as this father described, I just don't want to do it. I know it's me sticking my head in the sand. But what they were able to identify was that they wanted to have timely conversations. They described when and where it would either be helpful or unhelpful to have an initial conversation. And they described so beautifully that actually they did not want to be introduced to advanced care planning at moments of crisis or when they were in PICU, that they wanted gentle conversations at a time that was appropriate to them. And so they described, introduce us to advanced care planning, that would be helpful. And then we can choose whether in 6 months or within 2 years, we then might want to sit down with somebody and talk about it. So it was really important that we started to understand about the gentle conversations and introducing advanced care planning in a timely way. So the second category is reconciling multiple tensions. And this is where parents needed to find ways to express their values and beliefs and make sense of the complexity and the contradictions of advanced care planning. They wanted to make good and right decisions but they experienced real tension in not wanting their children to suffer, but voiced also that they wanted to sustain life at all costs. And their day-to-day decision-making was trying to balance these two tensions. So they were negotiating complex choices, and they had numerous choices which were influenced by so many different factors. So as this mother described here, every single time is a different management of each situation. So I might choose option A, and I would want you to do 1, 2, or 3, or it might be option B, and I want you to do 4, 5, and 6. And what came alongside that with parents was understanding the enormity of the decisions that they were having to make. And at times they felt out of control, and they were aware of the risks of the decisions, and they were really anxious to make right decisions. And as this mother described here, it's a huge responsibility, and these end-of-life decisions are momentous. One of the things that they also spoke about that we used as a context was enduring the heartbreak. Parents really struggled with the uncertainty and the overwhelming sense of loss. A mother described, "It's profoundly hard, and I'm living with the reality that I'm going to have to bury him." But what came out of this was that it was a cyclical process, and families talked about periods of crisis and then periods of stability. And the concept that we identified at this point was crossing thresholds of understanding, where parents had to readjust their thinking and their understanding each time that they met a different crisis. And so there were repeated cycles of crisis and stability, and they experienced this on multiple occasions. But families found ways and strategies to deal with this, and this was really important for them to be able to share, that they found ways to acquire knowledge. They gathered information in order to help them with the decision-making process. And one mum described, there's a network of mums online, and we share information together. And we found that actually parents found this information through their networks and not necessarily through clinicians, which I think is what we potentially assumed that they would be doing, and that they really wanted to engage in the conversation. So despite verbalizing that it was distressing, of course it was distressing talking about end-of-life decisions for their child, but actually that should not stop clinicians having the conversation. It is going to be distressing, but we do want to talk about it. And what began to emerge at this point was that whereas professionals assumed a rational decision-making approach, one that followed logical thinking and certainty, parents used emotion and intuition as a basis for their decision-making. And they had the capacity to keep all options open. So whereas professionals were looking at definitive answers to treatment decisions, parents had the capacity to have all options open and hold in that space a number of options and decisions at any one time. So the third category was that of building confidence and asserting control. And parents found that the completed written document they found liberating and empowering, and that they used advanced care planning as a vehicle through which to express their voice. It gave them a sense of security, and the completion of the ACP brought greater confidence and a sense of validity. So this mother described, "I feel more confident now because we've been through the advanced care planning process." But one of the things they were challenged with was that every professional across all settings would be aware of the advanced care plan, and they didn't want to have to repeat themselves, but they wanted to also know that if something should happen to their child when they were not there, that their wishes would be carried out. So the other really important finding from this study was the therapeutic benefit that we found that parents described about, and how important it was for parents to talk about being on the same page. It helped to know we were both on the same page. So they talked about where their wishes came together and how important that was, but also they were able to understand that whether there were differences between them as parents and whether that mattered or not. And so the conversations around advanced care planning really enabled them to have those conversations and to look at the similarities and difference between them. So throughout these categories, the one important theme was one of meaning making, where each time parents went through a crisis or a deterioration in their child's condition, they were needing to readjust their understanding and their concept of their world. And that led us to the core theory of reconstructing meaning through advanced care planning. So that advanced care planning then is best understood as a parental process of reconstructing meaning of their child's illness. So that advanced care planning challenged parents' previously held assumptions, values, hopes, and beliefs. And they felt that it encapsulated the actions and processes that they adopted, and that they purposefully used advanced care planning to challenge the presence of grief and loss and the decisions that they made. So the definition that we constructed behind this theory was that reconstructing meaning describes a cyclical process in which parents moved between, through, and around realization, reconciling multiple tensions, and building confidence and asserting control. That it wasn't a singular event, but a process where parents experienced multiple constructions of meaning. So why is this important to understand? So we've recognized that advanced care planning then is not just about sensitive communication skills or regular reviews, but it's about understanding the triggers that families have identified and about the complexity of the conversations and the decisions that they have to make and how they themselves manage the tensions and the options for care, understanding at the same time the profound emotional impact of talking about advanced care planning, but that parents want to engage in advanced care planning conversations. They use this to navigate the complexities, not to resolve them. They can sit with the uncertainty, whereas perhaps professionals cannot. So understanding what is important to parents and how they wish to engage in conversations and decision-making is crucial. So the application of this to practice, that we need to encourage early and continuous conversations. We need to provide space and time for parents to adjust and manage the uncertainties. And that will also enable parents to reorientate their values, their hopes, and their goals. So the two key recommendations from this study is that we need to reframe our approach to advanced care planning to one that fosters a series of conversations and embraces reconstructing meaning. To openly acknowledge the complexities and contradictions of advanced care planning for parents that will enable them to readjust their values and their goals as their child's condition deteriorates. So how have we put this into practice? At the beginning of my slide, I don't think I said it, but I'm also co-chair back in the UK for the Children and Young People's Advanced Care Planning Network. So we have gathered together those that really want to advocate and promote advanced care planning with parents. And we've used this study and the findings from this study and from other studies that have looked at parents' experience of advanced care planning to revise the form that we use and complete with parents, so the Children and Young People's Advanced Care Plan. And alongside that, we have developed a guide. We've been really fortunate to gain some funding from Marie Curie to write a guide that will support professionals in the process and conversations with families around advanced care planning. And I'm just so thrilled that Catherine Mannix, I don't know if you any of know her, she's written lots around grief and listening and communication, has written the foreword to this document. But we've also looked at how can we establish some resources and educational tools for professionals to help them understand about advanced care planning. And I'm really delighted to be able to share with you a video that we have just produced. It's only just been published, of a conversation between a mother whose child died this year, but how important advanced care planning was for her, and also the consultant palliative care, Emily Harrop, and they've both given their permission for me to share this with you today.
I'm Emily, I'm Neve's mum. Neve died recently after lots of support from Helen House.
I'm Emily Harrop. I'm a consultant in children's palliative care at Helen and Douglas House. And
I would say it's like a document that allows you to sort of plan ahead and think ahead to what your child might need sort of over their lifetime and at the end of their life, and allows you to put down details about what you would like and also what you would not like to happen to them, taking their needs and their interests into account. And it means that when you're in the moment, trying to make a difficult decision, you've already had some preparation for that.
I think it's important to think of an advanced care plan as a passport to the right care at the right time, and ideally in a setting that suits the need of the child and their family. It's really important not to see it as anything relating only to resuscitation, and so important to think that it contains elements of care that may be wishes, that may be hopes, and that may reflect some plans to address fears for the whole family. And I think seeing it in that way enables people to begin making one, even if they do that gently in a stepwise way, even if we don't talk about resuscitation in the first conversation.
I know we had a meeting with Neve's consultant at the hospital when we found out that Neve wasn't going to get better. And then about 5 days later, Neve had a big seizure and ended up in intensive care. And although just before that, we were sort of in a position of having to decide, do we put her on a ventilator or not? And I remember at the time thinking, but we haven't had any of these conversations. Like, I don't know how we're supposed to make this decision. So I think whether I knew about it as an advanced care plan or just that actually we needed to be having these conversations because she was quite unpredictable. So I guess that would be when I first remember the idea of thinking ahead like that. When we first started having more contact with Helen House, that we started to think about it and have conversations about it.
I think there's some lovely things in the story that Emily has told about Neve that illustrate that beautifully. So an advanced care plan tends to happen either at a crossroads that happens because of an acute event. So Emily spoke of Neve's unexpected seizure quite early in her disease course, really, when you think about the length of time she was under palliative care. And that would be something that you would hope would prompt a conversation, as you say, if planning hadn't yet had a chance to happen, because the situation was relatively new at that time. I think otherwise, we would see introduction to the palliative care team as another opportunity. So if there hasn't been a disease-related event, there may be an event related to who joins the multi-professional team that might prompt us to look at the planning and think, is there something here about consolidating these plans to make an advanced care plan? And of course, I remember from knowing Emily over many years that there are families such as hers who are very proactive, actually, and sort of seek out opportunities to inform themselves and plan.
So one of the things, actually, and I don't know if this is what it's designed for, but that I found really helpful with the advanced care plans is that when we knew, for example, that we might be having a meeting with Dr. Emily to discuss it, we would then have a look at it ourselves at home. And often we realized that we might not be fully on the same page, or maybe one of us understood something like this and somebody else understood that. And so then we were able to go to our meetings and sort of say, well, how does this work? And actually, every single time I remember Emily would explain it to us, and it would just provide such clarity. And we'd realize, oh, okay, actually, we are basically on the same page or close enough, but we just didn't fully understand what that meant. Any differences between myself and Neve's dad, we could sort of iron them out before we were in a situation of an acute situation having to make a decision. It made it really feel like actually it was a very wide sort of holistic view of her and how could we support her on her journey, looking at all of her and what mattered to her.
that for me, the really important elements are about enabling choices, and that choice, as we said a little bit, will be about a place that means something to a child and family, as well as treatments that would be important to consider, or actually to consider the benefits of differently. And I think for me, the art of doing a good advanced care plan is to really understand what the family most hope for and most fear still in their palliative journey, and to be able to offer realistic, meaningful, and practically achievable choices about their place of care, who may care for them, and actually what there may be in terms of any gaps to achieve their preferred place. And throughout this, it's absolutely important to get the family's language and context. I think it's really important not to dodge some of the sections that may feel sensitive. It's very possible either to prepare a family before a meeting by sharing an information sheet, or indeed a blank plan if the family feel able to or would like to read, so as to know what may be coming up. And some of those things include things like organ donation, tissue donation, and subjects that a family may not yet have thought about. But speaking to bereaved families may feel very sad if they haven't had the opportunity to chew over and make decisions about ahead of time. So
I suppose some of the things we found a bit more difficult were that Niamh was so up and down and unpredictable that it felt like it was very hard to capture her enough. So it made sense that we could sort of update the plan as time went on, and we did do that. But actually, there were times where if you updated the plan based on how she was that day, you would have made it very different to sort of if she then rallied again the next day. And so,
if I'm honest, I sometimes think the gatekeeping can happen with colleagues almost more so than with families. And I've said to Emily before, you know, I've had many situations where a family have come to Helen House for the first time, and I've asked open questions, and they've asked quite early on about planning for the worst as well as hoping for the best in some context, some allusion towards parallel plans, when colleagues have said to me, you mustn't talk about resus, you mustn't talk about care planning, they're not ready. And actually, perhaps when you unpack it, the people who were not ready may have been the referring or treating team. Actually, the parents may have been very attuned to their own child for quite some time and understand very sadly that death may be a possible outcome, and that the way to protect themselves a little from the enormity of that may well be to plan ahead.
in hindsight, and I'm not sure I thought about it at the time, but in hindsight, it almost felt a bit like a birth plan, where you sort of think through the options, think through what you would like, what you might like if that thing doesn't work, and and also accept, though, that actually you don't have control over it. But if you've not thought it through, then you are much less likely to end up in a situation that feels right.
And I also really enjoy the analogy with birth planning, because I've reflected on it since we first spoke about that, Emily, and realised that paediatricians among my peers are very comfortable with the concept of what a birth plan might look like, in that they do a lot of time on a delivery suite during their training, and they're very used to making parallel plans, there being uncertainty and having to manage an outcome. And I think if some of that language, you know, whether it's psychologically or philosophically for those doctors, could be invoked in terms of also having to plan for death, where death's a possible outcome, I do wonder if it would be a really good educational tool eventually.
That Niamh suffered, and Niamh suffered a lot, but I completely know that her suffering would have been unbearable without pediatric palliative care. So she had so much medical trauma that there was no way we could put her through anything else like that. And so pediatric palliative care just sort of picked her up and picked us up and gave her just, it allowed her to sort of live the rest of her life with as much sort of peace and respite and joy as was possible, given that.
I like the recent analogy of it being the umbrella, not the rain. The idea that palliative care, if given early, is something you may take with you, and you may never need to use to the extent that some families do. It may be something that protects you if and when the rain comes, but you're glad you had it before it started to rain.
Care. So I think all children in Niamh's situation should have access to it early on, so they can fall in love with it when they're still well enough to run around and create havoc in a hospice.
So I think both Emily's capture so beautifully the findings from the study, but the conversation is really powerful in how important advanced care planning is. So just in summary, parents purposefully use advanced care planning to navigate the complexity in care treatment decisions and manage the uncertainty. And it's both the process of the document and the conversation that contributes to the process of reconstructing meaning. So that advanced care planning supports parents to find meaning in the life and death of their child. Oh. You can all go for a break quick, it won't go to the... I just wanted to say a huge thank you for listening, and I really hope that the study has given strength to parents' voice in sharing about advanced care planning and what that means to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen.